All right. Did it notify people? It didn't notify me. This is the Kubernetes SIG Network for Thursday, September 28th, 2023. We are governed by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which basically boils down to don't be a jerk. So everybody, please be kind to each other. We are running on a schedule today, so we're going to jump straight in, bypassing triage, and go straight into topics. Antonio, the floor is yours.
Okay, do you want to keep the order or do you want to discuss the step first?
What do you mean?
I have two topics.
Oh.
And there are more people with steps.
Oh yeah, it's not your KEP first. Yeah, let's do KEPs first. So I'll move you to the bottom of the agenda if that's okay. Mache, you're first on the list then. Are you here?
Yeah, I'm here. That's not I'm not sure if you want to talk about caps. I'm not sure mine applies. Yeah, I can go if you want to.
Okay.
But
if you're not kept, then I'll push you back to the bottom too.
yeah, let's do that because I don't think mine's gonna. It is related to cap, but I'm not sure it's going to be. Maybe
Okay.
Let's put it in the bottom. Yeah.
Dave P, is this KEP related or design related?
It's a gap thing. So I don't know if that means I can sneak it in.
Is it
it might make
subject
sense
to the
do that
deadline in a
after-
week?
No.
Move to the bottom of the list. Antonio, you're back up.
Oh, okay. So we can play the game again. Okay, cluster cider. Context. We started with the service cider and cluster cider, and we say, oh, this overlap. We have discussions and we decided, okay, service cider is good. Cluster cider has an inconvenience because not everybody is going to implement it and can be confusing. I keep discussing this with Dan Winship, and he has a strong argument that I cannot refuse to make this a core API that means cluster cider, because his arguments are correct and saying that, well, you can have cluster cider, but they can have Ethereum, OpenShift, or whatever that is using another IPAN. And if I configure cluster ciders, this is not going to represent my cluster cider. Dan, correct me if I'm wrong. So the problem that we have now is that we merge this is alpha, and we need to decide if we want to keep this as core and how it's going to be named, or if we move it from core and we create a separate project with a CRT or something.
Who wants to argue?
So to that note, wasn't I think what you're trying to is to edit what we currently already merged, right? There was already cluster cider cap that was merged back in the day. So why we are backing out of this? And then other ask to this is if some other implementation didn't implement the core compatibility, why we shouldn't pursue it further on? I don't think a valid argument is that, oh, we didn't implement the core basic functionality, we have something of our own, so we shouldn't have this because that introduces confusion. Isn't that kind of implementation specific then? That's kind of that's what I'm thinking, right? If I have an implementation of my platform and I come up with my own stuff, and I'm going to oppose something that's the core is trying to push forward because it doesn't fit with mine. That's at least how I'm seeing that. Dan, yeah, go ahead.
So sorry, I missed the beginning, but we're talking about the cluster cider cap, right?
Yeah.
So the issue is that if you read the cap, it says that the goal is, to make it possible to extend the cluster cider and blah, blah, blah. But then it proposes a feature that just lets you reconfigure the node IPAM controller. And in the vast majority of Kubernetes clusters, just being able to reconfigure the node IPAM controller doesn't give you the ability to extend the cluster cider. So the cap isn't doing what it promises to do.
Maybe we overload here some words. Let's maybe define on, maybe this is where I'm missing. What do you mean by cluster cider then? Because that's maybe when I'm having a gap.
So the goal of the cap is to make it so that you can make the pod network bigger, so that you can, as you add nodes to the cluster, you can make the network bigger as well, so that those nodes have IPs to use, right? But with most network plugins, in order to do that, you need to adjust more configuration than just the node IPAM controller. And this cap doesn't provide any way to do that. And people have already tried to use it to implement that feature and other things in ways that then doesn't work and has subtle bugs, because the cap didn't even try to figure out how to make that work.
And adding to that, the cap is only for the built-in IPAM controller. If you use any other IPAM controller, this configuration can be completely ignored or not present.
And not only that, I think what Dan you're introducing here is, and that was never the case in the initial original design, is that it doesn't control what the CNI does. It's a hint, and maybe that's the main issue of this initial implementation of this. It's a hint which is not imposed on any of the CNIs, because it's a hint for the node. No, why not?
It's not a hint, though. It is a reconfiguration of the node IPAM controller. Like
no. Well, the evolution of it right now, yes, but I'm now stepping back to the pod CIDR field in the node, right? Because I think this whole cap is around that single field and how it worked till today, and this is what I'm referring to as currently the pod CIDR is a hint, right? For the CNI, if you want to, there is this field, and you can use it for your IPAM to how you want to do it, right? But if you don't, then just don't use it, right? That's what I'm referring to. And now the new cap is evolving the same, maybe flawed design that we did back in the days. Maybe not flawed. I don't want to kind of badmouth anyone that initially introduced that, because we use it, but that's maybe the problem here, right? And I see what you're saying, where what about enforcing that, right? Because that's what you would want to like. That's what I'm hearing. You would want to have this being properly enforced by the CNI down below.
No, it's more the opposite, that the node IPAM controller is something that the CNI plugin can choose to use or not use.
Yes, exactly.
And we need to, we're all in on that assumption. So we need to keep working with that assumption.
Okay.
And so therefore we need to assume that an API that lets you reconfigure the node IPAM controller is not an API that lets you extend the pod CIDR, because not all cluster network, CNI plugins use the node IPAM controller. And in some cases, they need to have other things adjusted if they want to extend the pod CIDR. So
isn't that just a matter of the implementation then catching up?
It's fundamental. It's the wrong feature. Like reconfiguring the node IPAM controller is part of an API to extend the pod network dynamically, but this cap presents it as though it's the whole API.
Yeah, Dan, just one thing to clarify for me. When you say change the pod CIDR, actually you mean changing, you can add in other CIDRs, right? Not necessarily change the size of the CIDR, right?
I mean, the larger problem is I want to keep adding nodes to my cluster to support bigger workloads, and at some point I'm going to run out of pod IPs, and I need
that is understandable. But sort of since I'm a network guy, I mean, there are more ways to do that than change the network mask, right? That's all I'm saying, asking, and sort of that you're covering both.
So I don't think that the cap mentions that we can resize, because that's what you're referring to. I don't think that's the case, right? It's immutable. Once at least from what I remember when we initially introduced this, the object, when you define a specific CIDR, it's immutable. You cannot change that. You can add new ones that kind of can expand that list, but I don't think you can change the current one, right?
Well, so if let's say I have a /24, shouldn't I then be able to add a /16 that contains /24?
Yeah, that was possible because overlap was supported. I agree with you. But then what we are mixing here, and I think I saw that similar case where we are treating the /16/24 as a subnet, which should not be, is not the case. Those are just ranges right here, and we should treat those as ranges. So I want to use those ranges, and how I'm routing can do that. That's completely separate and independent out of this. Team?
So there's some confusion about whether this API purports to be authoritative, like the source of truth for the configuration, right? I think we all agree it can't be. So if it's non-authoritative, then it really is only a configuration mechanism for a particular controller that we don't even have in our tree yet. That would be an extension or new version of a controller that we do have in our tree. So we have this precedent of having an IPAM controller built in with a configuration. That configuration happens to be a flag today. The question then, I think, if I can get to the heart of what Dan's concern is, should we continue with that convention of having a built-in IPAM controller that has a configuration resource which is modeled through the API surface? Or should we say, get out of here, this is a perfect example of what should not be in tree, and find a different mechanism, node spec pod cider, you can use it if you want to, but if you want to have more than one pod cider per node, for example, it's just not going to work for you. Find a different mechanism because you're out of the tree. Is that a fair distillation, Dan?
So there are two issues. One is what you just said, that, does this belong in tree, or would it make more sense out of tree? But the other thing is that the CAP is presenting itself as a pod network extending feature. And as Antonio had pointed out, Flannel, some people made changes to Flannel to read these cluster CIDR objects and reconfigure Flannel based on them, because they were treating it as a pod network extending feature, not as a node IPAM reconfiguring feature. But the feature isn't designed in a way to work arbitrarily as a pod network extending feature. And so the way that Flannel did it doesn't actually work right and will create bugs. So if we're going to keep this CAP and have this in-tree reconfigurable node IPAM controller, we need to make it very clear. This is a node IPAM controller reconfiguring CAP. This is not about extending your pod network. We should remove all of the goals and all of the user stories that talk about dynamically extending the pod network, because it doesn't implement that feature for most users.
There is another dimension, that most of the people that use the node IPAM controller are the cloud providers, and in this release we are going to better with the removal of the in-tree cloud provider.
Sorry, Antonio, you broke up a little bit for me. I don't know if it.
I know what he was saying, because we've talked about this, so I'll clarify that also a lot of the cloud providers are switching to using the external cloud controller stuff, which have their own separate node IPAM controllers, so they won't even be using the one that this CAP is modifying in Kube Controller Manager anyway, which is a third problem.
So if somebody came to us with a brand new idea for an entirely different model of IPAM that was based on machine learning, and they said, we want to put this controller into Controller Manager, we want to add an API resource to configure it, what would we say?
We already did it. Do it outside of KK.
Right.
I mean, I feel like the fact that Node IPAM controller is in KCM is just an artifact of how GCE networking works. Like,
I mean, it was the expedient and thing to do when we were doing it. We didn't have CRDs, so like we worked with the toolbox we had at the time. We have a much more robust toolbox now. So, Antonio, I can't tell from... Sorry, go ahead.
No, say.
Oh, I can't tell from all the conversations we've had about this, what your actual position is. Like, should we just abort the alpha and say this should be an out of tree controller with an out of tree custom resource?
I think that is a nice project for contributors to grow there. I mean, I see that this can expand and grow in their own, because they can build on all these things that Dan was saying, right, about extending the pod network and everything, and it will be easier to consume for people for doing more things than just doing the pod side of things. I mean, it's not a big project, it's small and it's nice.
Yeah.
So new contributors can, and we have always this problem, right? At the end, we don't have enough people to work in core, and we have this other problem is that it's too hard to get in core. So I think that this is a good thing to get new contributors and grow into that.
Okay. I think I agree. As much as I like the idea of making a more robust version of the existing IPAM controller, it's probably a false start in the first place. And so cutting it off before it grows too many more limbs seems like a reasonable argument. If we kick this out of tree, it means we basically have to start it over. They can take a lot of the controller code, but the custom resource and stuff will have to be redefined.
And we'll probably want to say
It's
that.
a nice project. I can help. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say we'll probably want to change the documentation around node spec pod ciders to say that the network implementation is allowed to change it for its own purposes.
What?
In sort of not specified ways. We need to make it clear that out of tree components are allowed to touch node spec pod ciders now, right? So it's like
no, but that was always the case.
Is it? I thought.
I mean, that's a field, right? I mean, there is nothing preventing anybody to use the node spec pod cider. Just you can fight if you have the queue controller managed. Actually, that was the bug that we have with the migration to the external cloud provider. We have two controllers fighting for this field. Going to the validation code.
Cal has a hand.
I think 90%, if not more, of the clusters out there can live with just simple cloud like ciders and whatever we have right now. And that serves the purpose, and it has served the purpose. And I do understand Dan's comment, oh, this modeled after this particular cloud network and how it works. That's fine, happened in the past. And frankly speaking, nobody cares about this in the cloud side. Outside the cloud, a lot of people do worry about this. But even us at our side of the fence, we don't. Like, everything is done to allow this to happen anyway. Now, the growth, if you want to do like dynamic changing and all of that stuff that we talked about, I favor outside the tree, just by virtue of simplifying the code that we worry about and all the stuff that we need to build and all the stuff that we have to think about for all the n by n by n matrix of use cases, allowing people to either use some standard outside the tree controller should work, and everybody who has a special case can build their own. All right. Now the question remains, should the API in the core be generic enough to allow n per node, n ciders per node, or should we say, oh, this is how it will work. The core supports only one cider, but if you want growth, go use some other controller or build your own API. Right? I'm worried that we end up with n number of APIs out there. Everybody will come up with their own API, which will make the ecosystem extremely fragmented. So maybe we should follow what Rob did in the gateway API, like having a common API external that's loadable, and then people will focus on the controller only. So it's somewhere in the middle. Just a thought out there.
So my concern here is I don't like Gateway. We had a lot of evidence of what that API should look like when we tried to bring it together to having a common API. And we knew where the extension points probably were. I don't know, we weren't 100% correct, but we were pretty close. I have no idea if there's one API that describes what multiple implementations would or should do here. So my recommendation is that we kick it out and we say, if there's an alignment, if there are other implementations that want to use a common API, that's a great goal, but it shouldn't be a requirement of this project to continue. Is that fair?
I do not agree on this. I would argue that the API for multi-sider network is a lot simpler than a gateway. Yes, it has a degree of complexity to get. I do see your point around, oh, we were not sure everything out there and we cannot enumerate it, but I think we can get pretty close.
So I worry that we end up reinventing the problem that Dan started with, which is this an authoritative API or is this a reflective API? I don't know enough about all the multitudes of network plugins out there that how they would go about actually reconfiguring their pod networks. And in fact, it sort of gets into the multi-network proposal too. Like trying to make this the one true authoritative API for that one little aspect of network definition seems like a slippery slope. If people want to agree that there is a reflective API that is configured for IPAM controllers and that this is what it should look like, I am certainly not going to get in the way. That sounds like a great outcome, but I don't want to make that the true North Star. Like, I think that the goal here is here's a controller implementation that does what the existing one does, but is a little bit smarter.
Does it need to be authoritative? I mean, if it's outside, people can ignore it and build their own, right?
But is it authoritative when you're using it? Like,
but then it's up to you, right? How you treat it in your implementation. And since it's not in core, you just don't import it, right?
So there are two ways to look at this: the outside, the end towards outside, which is the current discussion, but also there is the outside end discussion that usually we tend to keep it to last. I'm worried that we end up with a situation where you have somebody who spent years operating very large sum of clusters using certain way and then goes somewhere else and it's the same cluster, same binary, same everything, but oopsie daisies, a completely different stack for you to manage using different APIs because some vendor decided that we don't like this.
That's already how network plugins work, right?
Yeah, that's the nature of
yeah. All right, fair point. Fair point. I agree.
Antonio?
Yeah, so the thing is, there are a lot of unknowns. The network code discussion is going forever. Multi-network is going to bring it to the table again, and we are going to keep discussing. But this allows this project to have an implementation, and we can revisit the decision, right? We now do this. We start to see that everybody uses it. We can say, oh, now this made sense, and we may do this API core, or we have some lessons learned, but I don't see that we have problem to follow up with this and it's blocking me with the service sider and I don't think that we need to keep discussing this every year. So
okay, so
we can take a decision today.
It's in the notes. Antonio, do you want to follow up with an email to SIGNet and the folks who are working on the multi-sider existing implementation to say this was the discussion, this is the decision that we've made, like scream now or forever after be quiet?
Look, the decision is we create a new project with a CRD and a new node IPAM controller.
Yes, we move it out to the SIGs repo and we treat it like an arm's length project with always like the reservation that we could revisit this decision later. But for now, it seems like that's the cleaner encapsulation.
I was going to say something similar. I mean, turn it inside out and say, assume that it's the CNIs that handles this, what part of the system actually needs to know the address space for the pods.
Right. Okay. Antonio, can you send that email?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, cool. I'm going to have to drop in a minute. If it's okay if before we jump into the design topics that we run through KEPs real quickly? just to make sure that we're on the right track. Give me 1 second and I will share a screen. I appreciate everybody who has kept the table up to date in this project dashboard. It's been actually helpful. I went through them the other day and it looked like it was mostly up to date. Share. Anyone see this?
Yeah.
All right. I pinged a couple. I'm just going to run through these super quickly. Please scream if the current disposition here is not correct. My assessment of host network support for Windows pods is we still have no idea whether it's going anywhere. Given the deadline is in like 8 days or something, it sounds like it's not going into 29. Dual stack API server support is looking for someone to own it. Dan, is that right?
Yeah. I mean, or somebody needs to work with the API server team to push that forward, because.
Okay.
Can we postpone this to once we have the locators and everything? Because I'm getting to approval in that area. So if we don't have to rush it, I may get the right permission.
And Antonio, you're cutting out, but it sounded like you just said, "I volunteer to take this."
No, like
don't do that.
Not this release, but
okay. I'm going to push forward.
This
that's
release.
postponed. Yeah, it is postponed unless somebody were to step up anyway. So SRV is not getting any attention. Component config is still the zombie proposal that needs to be addressed. Dan, with your NF tables stuff, maybe that gives us a path towards a simpler config here. But that would be a long path. This one, load balancer behavior, it got kicked out last time because it shouldn't have been committed. Looks like it's set for alpha in 29. Multiple service-siders we just talked about. Multi-network.
No, we didn't talk about
Oh,
that.
sorry, not service-siders, yes. You're still planning alpha in 29?
Yes, and I need reviewers. I will send a...
I'm running through KEPs in all my free time right now, so you're on my short list.
Cool.
Okay. Multi-network is not going into 29, right?
I don't think we will make it now.
Okay. NF tables, Dan, first of all, I want to say anybody who hasn't read this KEP should go read this KEP. It was an excellent KEP at a great level of abstraction with details, but not so many details. It was a really good KEP. Thank you, Dan. Alpha 29, yes?
Yeah, I feel like the KEP ought to merge like in a week or so, because you were basically okay. Wojciech was basically okay.
Well, we've got until the 6th to get it merged, right? So, okay. There's a relatively new proposal for disabling health check ports for load balancers, sort of the same way we allow disabling node ports. I hate it, but I acknowledge the use case. And so I haven't seen a KEP yet, but the author says they would like to get it in 29. IPAM for multiple cluster siders is what we just talked about. Host IPs looks like it is set to move beta in 29. Dual stack node IP handling, beta in 29, Dan?
Yep.
Okay. Alexander, are you here?
I am.
We're set for beta in 29 on your improvements?
Yeah, we haven't had any bugs, so according to what we agreed upon on the KEP, yeah.
Excellent. Admin network policy is not phase locked, but I do need to come back to that. We did this, that's the same. Node port reservations looks like it's set to GA in 29. There's been no objections or problems that I've seen. Topology aware routing. Rob, you indicated that 29?
Yeah, staying in beta, there were some updates that we wanted to do in the last cycle. They were missed in the last cycle. I think we're on track to hit them in this cycle, but the KEP is unchanged for the cycle. We're just catching up to what we wanted to have in the cap
Okay.
in the cycle.
And then the rest are all scheduled for cleanups in 30 or are complete. Are there any KEPs that are SIG Network that are not on this list? Okay. Purely selfishly, I'm a little happy that the list is getting small. It means that we can start to give some real bandwidth to some of the bigger issues that we've been ignoring. And this has been a hellish cycle for me. If you have a KEP that isn't on this list, I'm going to stop sharing. If you have a KEP that isn't on this list and you think should be, please tag it SIG Network and let me know and we'll look at it. I've gone through and everything that looked like it was going to get touched in 29, I added the opted in label. And if you find the KEP that you're responsible for is not queued up and making the release team happy, please let me know as soon as possible, please. With that, I'm going to have to drop. So I'm going to hand ownership over to who wants ownership? Dan, you're first on my screen, so you're going to get it.
Okay.
And you can run the rest. Where are you? There you are. Dan Moore. Make host. You are now the host, and I have to drop off. Wonderful to see everybody. I asked on the chat also on Slack who's going to KubeCon. Let me know because I'd like to see about planning, events and lunch and stuff. So if you get a second, just look at that thread and say yes, no. Thanks, everyone.
So I missed the beginning of the meeting, but I think, Antonio, we're on your other item now.
Yeah, this is quickly. So, and you're the most familiar with this. When the kubelet starts, has a complex logic to set up the node address, right? And now with the external cloud providers, it has a more weird logic. So it seems that some cloud providers depend on the addresses to be populated, and then they shortcut the node startup, and they add some addresses that then later are overridden by the external cloud provider. The problem is that if those addresses, the ones that are added in the startup and the ones that are added later by the cloud provider are not the same, the host network pods are going to have different addresses, right? Depending when they are created. So I don't think that this is a correct behavior. So I have a pull request. I open an issue, and Andrew Syken and other person from cloud provider vSphere are complaining, but they have the problem that they have is that when the node starts, the pods are scheduled, they don't have IPs. So that's another bug that is related to that. If we change the kubelet logic to set up the addresses only when the cloud provider set addresses, there is a time that the node is ready, but doesn't have any address at all. So the pods start and they don't find any IP. And that to fix that bug, then one option is we should not set the node ready until they have addresses. So all this thing is a chain of unfortunate consequences because nobody thought about that, and it's scary to change. But I think that we need to close this problem as soon as possible to not carry on with that, and then we cannot revert this decision. Nobody using cloud providers external.
Yeah, I mean, other than Google people, I don't see a lot of heavily cloudy people here.
They use Carl is not.
It looks like he dropped off.
I will go to cloud providers. So is there any inconvenience in setting the kubelet in SIG network, saying that the kubelet should not have readiness until they have the addresses and not shortcut address logic? Or maybe you think that
the cloud provider itself runs somewhere, right?
Yeah, it's an external cloud provider.
Yeah, but I mean, it runs as a pod, right?
Yeah, it can run, I don't know, in whatever you want.
So, I mean, I guess we need to make sure that that's not going to interfere with the cloud provider itself. If you want to run the cloud provider as a pod, and it starts up without having a host IP.
Maybe that's what is happening to the vSphere people. Okay, I think that then I will make a wider announce to everybody, so and try to write it to explain better the problem. Another mailing list. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, Mache, I think you're up next.
Can I have presentation? I have some slides I want to kind of show. I want to go over them I will try to go over them quite quickly. So I just want to kind of give you an update on what did we do for the last few months. We initially divided the whole multi-networking effort into few phases, and we are considering that designing for the phase 1 as completed, and I want to give you an update on that. So I just want to kind of go overview of what.
So you're not actually sharing right now, and I don't know how to let you share. Does anybody else?
On the list
just made a co-host.
Yeah, you can make me a co-host. Just find my name on the list. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, so let me quickly go over this. So as I started talking, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so as I mentioned, we have the phases and we consider the first phase completed. And I want to kind of go over of what we kind of come with. So this is just a reminder of what our goal mainly is to ensure that we have some sort of handle representation of a network inside Kubernetes cluster, something that we don't have today. We want to have some sort of standardization of the API, and the ultimate goal is to provide some main use cases, and I want to kind of talk about them as well later on. But first, just to kind of ensure that what is a network, and in our design, we decided that we don't want to put any enforcement what a network, a specific implementation think as. So we don't put any emphasis on that, any definition, and we don't impose any definition of it. And it will boil down to how the implementation thinks what a network for them is. So this is very important, so that we don't want to make it as flexible as possible here. That's kind of the gist of this. The main use cases that we want to cover, we have more in a link I will have at the end of the presentation, but the two ones that I want to kind of put emphasis on is the basic, like multiple interfaces into the pod. So, and in this case, and I have some description of a user story where some sort of an separation of traffics where I could identify in my workloads two types of traffics, which for some sort of compliance, I need to isolate across my infrastructure. So here I want to have two interfaces inside the pod, and my application is smart enough to pick and choose which interface to use for what. So that's one use case. And the other use case is basically the multi-tenancy via multi-networking. So not multiple interfaces into the pod, but multi-networks in the cluster, a single cluster. And then I want to have some pods connecting to one network and some pods to the other networks without losing any Kubernetes capabilities, right? So services, network policies, etc., all functioning in parallel in the such cluster. How the networks, how pods communicate across networks, that's up to the vendor and whether they want to route them or not, how they interact. This is of course up to the implementation, but the cluster itself provides you the capability to, I want my namespace pod networks connected to a specific interface or a network representation of a network, right? So those are the kind of two highlighted use cases I want to talk about. So what we want to propose and what we come up with is to introduce a new core object called pod network. It will be representing it will be the handle that the pod connects to. It has to be vendor agnostic, and it will include what we come up with. We kind of copy pasted stuff from Gateway API. So we want to provide a capability for any implementation to plug into this and provide their own parameters, what's not, to this object so that they can parameterize it as the way they want to. And here's an example of this. Basically, what does it show is simple things like provider to be multi-vendor, to have multi-vendor capabilities in single cluster if someone needs that, and then just simple parameters to your custom things. This is a list. Something new that we want to do as well. Details in the design doc that I'm gonna have in the link, but yeah, we want to make it a list. And basically, pod network is the thing that we want to then have a reference to across all the other core objects in Kubernetes. That's the kind of central point of this. We want to introduce as well something called default pod network, as we and think about this as a default namespace we have today in the cluster. So default pod network represents whatever we treat today's network as. So basically, whatever we connect in today's cluster. Two is basically default network, right? It comes with the when the cluster is created. There is a ways to auto create it. So for some cluster that don't really care about this, it will be just there in the background and they don't really have to worry about it and think about this. This will be completely transparent to clusters that really probably 90% of the clusters that don't need to and care about the pod networking. The other object that we want to introduce to the story is a pod network attachment. So this is a more kind of for some of the implementations to provide more flexibility to configuration of the pod network. Pod network attachment points to a pod network, so it still is part of a specific one pod network, but then it provides a pod level parameterization to the attachment, how specific pods attach to a specific pod network. With this, we want to provide an ability where pod network, it can be a logical representation of some network that in my implementation is a thing, and then how I really attach it, then the pod network attachment can specify that even further, right? That can be like, for example, what physically I'm connecting, how physically I'm connecting to that specific logical pod network would be defined by this pod network attachment. And of course, it comes with a vendor specific custom resource as well on top of that. So you can specify those in two places, and those can be completely separate CRs in your implementation. This is just a simple example, very similar to the previous one. This one has just the mandatory pod network name. So basically to which pod network the pod network attachment kind of belongs to. And then some custom optional parameters if you need those. Now, with all this, now we want to as well introduce changes to the pod spec. And this, what we mean by that is we would like to, this will be the first core object that we want to modify, because in phase one, we just want to introduce the API and have a means to use it somehow. So we want to introduce change to pod spec, and this is I'm aware we have to go to the other SIGs to talk about this, but this SIG networking I'm using as my guinea pig to kind of go through this presentation. So my next steps is to go to those other SIGs and talk about this, but I want to introduce a network sections in the pod spec. over there, we would identify what pod network name I want to attach to. And this can be exchangeable, either pod network name, or I can specify as the last one item where I can specify my pod network attachment name. So one of the two. And of course, this section is optional. If you don't specify it, we will auto-populate with the default name, and it will just function similar to, if I'm not mistaken, there is a field called node name, which is filled in by a scheduler. You can set it out yourself, but if you don't, then scheduler will put the node name into a pod spec. So this is something similar to what we want to do here with the default pod network. Additionally, on top of the pod spec change, we want to change as well pod status. This is smaller changes. This was luckily quite well prepared for dual stack. So we have already a struct in the pod IPs, which has only the IP definition. What we'd like to do is expand that struct with a pod name. That will basically kind of link the specific IP to a specific pod network. And that's the only thing we need basically to list what's what, so that we can in that list to properly identify which IP belongs to which pod network. Pod IP field would stay unchanged, would behave the same way it is. And we have an interface name. I don't want to go into that, but in the doc, if you have some question that you can read on this and leave some comments. Pod scheduler changes. What the only change we would like to do is the pod scheduler to do some basic validation of the pod names. We don't want to provide here some sort of a selectiveness of a pod network where pod network is available where. We don't want to do in phase one. So this is very straightforward and simple change initially, where we would like the scheduler to just see whether the pod network even exists. That's one first. And then the other thing, there are some conditions in the pod network object we want to leverage to see, okay, whether the network is ready or not. If it's not, then just block the scheduling of such pod, and then provide the proper state for the pod itself when a specific pod network doesn't exist or it's not ready. So basically, this is small, but maybe big change, but very minimal as we can. Where are we at with this in the terms of project status? As I mentioned, we have our use cases and requirements defined. The one that I initially provided, that was just from like 8 that we defined. I have a link at the end that you can look at. Then we consider the phase 1 design complete, which I just show you. Basically, we defined with the CRs and what sort of changes we want to come and how some behavioral dependencies defined. And initially the implementation was targeted for 129, but since we have just 1 week till end of cap closure, probably that won't happen. So I'm changing the target for 130 to have this implemented. And the links. There's a PR and there's a phase 1 design doc. So currently, in the coming few days, I will try to merge that doc into that PR app, where you can you can comment either in the PR or inside the doc. And that's all I want to show. All right, thank you. Any questions? I'm going to do it. Sorry. Ooh, that was.
No, it's cool. I appreciate the presentation. I had lost track of everything that was going on, but it all seems reasonable to me. Don't have any questions personally.
Yeah, likewise. I lost track of what the working group was doing, but every slide you put up, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. If you have the slide links to the slides is in the minutes, and then those links are in the slides. So please feel free to. I think all the links are open for comments, so please free drop any if you want to, or read through what more details the design has. Thank you.
All right, the last agenda item is Dave P, but we don't seem to have any Dave Ps, and we are basically out of time anyway, unless somebody here is secretly Dave P.
Yeah, I think he dropped, but that's fine. We can cover it next time.
All right.
One question, Rob. Is this get process aligned to the K process? Because he mentioned this is.
Yeah, it started out as a very lightweight enhancement proposal process, and it keeps on picking up more and more things. So it's getting closer to the weight of a KEP process, but not quite there yet.
But the timeline is not right.
Correct.
Okay.
It's separate. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Great. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.